Let's talk about what we're going to work on next, and that's going to be setting up CSS into your HTML. I've set up a really basic HTML file in my Sublime text editor. And of course, if we look at it, it's HTML5. It's really clean. It's really simple. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save my file, and I'm going to save it into my project, and I'm going to call it the index.html. Again, it's in the root directory. It's my index, and you notice in Sublime, as soon as I've saved it as an index.html, the color coding came in. So I've saved my file, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show it to you in full screen. This is easy for you to look at the text. Again, it's really, I don't normally work in large font like this, but it's easy for us to take a look at it. And one of the great things about Sublime is I have multiple tabs. So there's two things that I'm going to do to set this file up. One, I'm going to set up my index. It's my first working document. Even if I'm working in page templates, I still want to create the index. I'm going to show you my example here. I'm going to close out of this. And what I'm going to work on next is I'm actually going to go to a browser window. I'm going to use Chrome for right now. I'm just going to create a brand new window. And I'm going to make sure that I open the file that I just created. Again, we're always talking about the environment. We're always talking about how we're setting up our file. And the critical thing is I want to keep that index always open on one or two browsers. In this case, I'm going to start with Chrome for this example. I always want to have it open. Of course, it's empty right now. And as we add things, we're going to start going back and checking. Back and forth. You always, as you edit CSS, as you edit things, you want to make sure that you're working. I'm going to come back here. I'm going to say test. I save this. I reload. Here's my working file. And again, this really need to be really critical about the environment. Always have these browsers open, constantly saving things. Little bit of a sidetrack conversation. The majority of problems that you will make in CSS will be very tiny. And it'll be forgetting a colon, forgetting a backslash, forgetting a bracket. We want to catch those. And if we catch them in the browser, we know we've caught them live. Let's come back here. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to create a CSS file. Let me go back up into full screen mode. I have a new tab here, and I'm just going to create an empty file. I'm going to save this. I'm going to actually put it in my CSS file, and then I'm going to name it. And this is the critical convention about CSS. HTML has file name convention. It might be a .html, .htm. For CSS, it's really simple, a .css. Usually I like to refer to something as main.css. We'll talk about this further in a next section about why and how we're going to set up CSS into multiple files. I like to start with one. I'm going to call main CSS. I'm going to go back to my browser. And of course, nothing has happened yet. And the reason that nothing's happened yet is that it hasn't been connected to my HTML file yet. So let's talk about doing that next. I'm going to open it in full screen mode, and where my CSS file is going to live is in the header. One of the other things that I like to do as I work is, you notice that I kept the browser window open. I also like to keep a browser window open for me to actually reference things in. Again, no developer is an island. You're not working just by yourself. There's a wonderful thing which is the World Wide Web, and I always like to go back and forth to actually pull examples. In this example, I'm going to open up my Chrome window, and I'm going to show you a couple of reference pages that I've added, and there are real simple ways of copy and pasting. I love copy and pasting because when you're coding and you're tired, the fastest thing to mess up a file is forget something. So I like to copy and paste, and there you go. I've added my entry code into my HTML. There are actually 3 ways to insert a CSS file in HTML. I just showed you the first way. The first way is we're actually going to be linking one CSS file to your HTML. The critical thing that you have to remember about HTML is things are linked. So if you decide to move that CSS file, you're going to break it. If you decide to rename the CSS file, you're going to break it as well. So really what we want to do is set that standard in place to decide How many CSS files are we going to work on? Am I going to work on 1 or 2? I like to start with one main file. I like to keep it in my CSS folder so that my first global tags and my IDs are going to live in there. I might change it up, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but let's first start about these 3 different techniques. The first technique is just linking the style. In this case, I might actually link it to main.css. I hit save. Nothing really is that exciting. The one thing I am going to do is, remember, this is in my index. This is in a folder called CSS. I want to make sure that I'm connecting to that directory. There are 2 schools of thought, people that will use relative links and absolute links. Relative links are things like I want to make a reference to my JS folder. I want to make a reference to my CSS folder, so I'll use CSS. Absolute links are people are going to want to put in www.mywebsite.com/CSS. Why this is special is when you're working with a lot of things, let's say outbound marketing, CSS for an email, or CSS for, let's say, you're working on another website and you need to keep, for some reason, the CSS somewhere else. You're going to work with absolute links. And this is a perfect introduction to the second way of creating HTML and CSS. And these actually can work together. So that's a critical thing for you to remember. Inserting CSS, it's not an absolute. It's not one or the other method. Things can work together. Why is it kind of unique? If you're looking at an example, let's say the perfect example is an outbound marketing email. It's an email that's sent to your inbox. You want to add a little bit of coding. So what you might not do is you might not connect to a main.css. You might use an absolute or absolute link. But in this case, you don't know if they have an internet connection. So in this case, what we're actually going to do is we're going to embed CSS inside my header. And again, you notice my power it works when I didn't close the bracket. It said, hey, by the way, this is broken. And here's where I can add a style tag. And this is where I could actually add in reference to, let's say, body. And we'll talk about how these syntax work. We'll talk about in the body tag, there is a background color is red. And I actually messed this up already. I actually am supposed to put entry brackets and close brackets. And you notice as soon as I did that, the colors work perfectly. This is what's referred to as an inline CSS style, meaning I could have an inline style in my page. I would actually, it's just like having a separate CSS file connected here. In this case, let's say if I was going to put this in my CSS file, I would just copy it in there and save it. If I come back here and I wanted to have it inline, I would save it here as well. Let's say another perfect example is I wanted to create a class. Again, classes are designated by periods. As we go through and start setting them up, we'll talk about how to mark one and the other. So as a quick example, I'll just say I have a class called text, and it is a color of red. It pops in here. I could add it to my inline. The other way, and this is the third way of adding CSS, is to actually reference it within an HTML tag. I don't recommend this because a lot of times what happens is if you don't have access to the HTML, you actually have no ability to change it. So let's say an example is I'm going to bold something, and I'm going to say bold text. I close the bracket, again, really critical that I didn't mess it up. And to do a sort of that third method, I would actually create style. Put a style tag in here, and I can actually copy that into here. And I actually don't want the class. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to put in color red, and then it gets designated. Again, not something I want to do, but it has its uses. Again, a perfect example, which is really common. I send a file to someone. it's a email, or it might be a file that is going to be opened locally, and you want it to still look good, you want to make reference to a lot of these styles within the file itself. Again, if you want more information, I always like to create reference file. This is a great example I have from the W3 schools in terms of the three methods. The first one being linking, the second one being that internal style sheet of how I would add the style tags in the header. Again, you always want to have them in the head. The power of HTML is that HTML is broken apart into the head, which is all the page information, and the body where the content lives. So we want to put that style into the header. And then this example of the inline style, using the style tag inside a piece of code to make a reference to it. And again, part of it is this might be something that we would put into the non-functional technical document to decide, how are we doing this? Are we linking style sheets? Are we creating an inside style sheet in the header? Or are we creating an individual style per tag? Again, it really talks about the flexibility of how you're going to be working, whether or not you want to be quickly changing stuff. Again, the power of CSS is I can come in here and decide one day, I don't want it to be red, I want it to be white, and I can change it automatically without having to change the code. The power of CSS is we can also use it in other programming platforms. So a perfect example is I've been working on Ruby on Rails project, and there the code is compiled. So being able to go into an HTML code is actually going to be harder than me being able to open the CSS file, do a couple of quick edits on the CSS file, and now I've changed the visual styling of the page because I might not be able to access that HTML file. So again, it's all about the different usage patterns that you're going to be working in CSS. And for this example, we're actually going to be working on just linking to a file. Again, we'll talk about this next. We'll talk about the next stage of inserting CSS. But now we can actually save our files. I save my white background. Let's change it back to red. And now I go back to my browser window. I'm going to reload it. And bum, bada, ba, bum, here I have a red background. All handled in the CSS. I'm actually going to go back to my inspector just to show you that it's working. Here's my HTML in the Google Inspector. As soon as I get rid of this and I close the window, here you go, the styles disappeared. CSS at work. So now we've seen how CSS works, and we've showed how quickly it works together. Remember we are actually looking at 3 ways to add CSS into your documents and into your web pages. The first one being an external file, the second one being an internal style in the header tag, and the second being an inline. Again, the next step from here is we're going to look at resetting a lot of this HTML using a reset.css. I'll show you how HTML has a couple of attributes that are actually built into it, and we're going to be looking at cleaning that out. So we'll be talking about that next.